Behind him trailed over 80 pack horses, carrying several tons of trade goods. The cargo's value is hard to determine because it was so large. It came from Philadelphia, and its destination was Fort Pitt, a 300-mile journey that took Callender and his men from the largest city in British North America to one of its most isolated outposts. Callender's partner, George Crowan, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, was already at Fort Pitt waiting for the supplies before starting his own risky mission. Crowan's task was no small one. He was to bring peace to North America. For the previous 2 years, Great Britain had waged a deadly and costly war against a powerful Native American military alliance based in the greater Ohio River Valley and the Illinois country, what the British called Indian country. The war began in Detroit when an Ottawa military chief named Pontiac made a surprise attack on the British post in the summer of 1763. For the next 2 years, united Native American forces raided other British forts and colonial settlements, mainly in western Pennsylvania. They fought to reclaim land, to limit the growing power of the British in North America, and to oppose the subjugation British officials tried to impose on them. It was a war to assert their independence. The conflict tested the British military's capabilities and devastated many colonial communities. By the winter of 1764, several of the warring native groups, feeling strained themselves and realizing the British would probably agree to their terms, decided to negotiate peace. Crowan was assigned to make this peace a reality, and Callender's cargo was the key to accomplishing it. Crowan's strategy was bold. First, he would host a major treaty meeting at Fort Pitt to renew old alliances with the Shawnees and Delawares. Then, with their backing, he would travel down the Ohio River with a fleet of flat-bottomed boats loaded with the trade goods Callender was carrying across the Appalachians. Crowan planned to dispense the cargo as gifts to the Indian communities he visited while venturing deeper into the American interior. He knew that many of the native groups were still declared enemies of the British, but he hoped that this show of generosity would reassure them of Great Britain's dedication to cooperation and partnership. His real goal, however, was to find Pontiac. Crowan expected that his conciliatory message would persuade this leader and his supporters to accept peace, thereby creating the stability the British Empire so desperately wanted on its frontiers. With peace and stability would come the trade and prosperity needed to free Great Britain from the burden of managing its North American colonies. For imperial officials then, the British Empire's own independence depended on the success of this mission. However, Callender realized the problem with Crowan's plan as he traveled farther into the frontier and confronted colonists who were opposed to his mission. At every turn, settlers warned him to stop, to return to Philadelphia. They weren't worried about the dangers of his journey. Instead, they were worried that any peace would be false. These colonists had lived through nearly a decade of war, first against the French and their native allies, and then against Pontiac and his alliance. They had developed a very different understanding of the empire and its future, an idea of the West that formed during the violence and fear of the preceding years. At the heart of this disagreement, one that would influence the coming of the American Revolution in this region, was the status of Native Americans within the British Empire. Although imperial officials in London and the eastern seaports wanted to incorporate trade and good relations with Indians into their plans for the empire's future, colonists in war-torn regions felt there could be no peace with Native Americans. These colonists instead saw native groups as threats that needed to be removed. Their vision was also based on a desire for independence. They wanted to be freed from their fear of Indians. They thus had their own idea of what independence meant on the frontiers of North America. These conflicting views collided as Callender marched west, and the farther west he went, the stronger the opposition. Insult and empty threats soon turned into physical violence and armed confrontations. On March 6th, as the pack train neared a gap in the Appalachian Mountains at the base of Sidling Hill, the disagreement between colonists and the British Empire turned explosive. Shots rang out from the woods, and smoke from long rifles filled the air. Soon the woods echoed with hollering in the style of Indian warriors. As the dust settled, a group of colonists appeared, dressed like Native Americans and with faces smeared black with charcoal. therefore earning them the name Black Boy.